We have all been uniquely and lovingly created in the image of God and called to live in fusion with Him and with one another. I'm Robert Ricciardelli, and welcome to the Converging Zone. Welcome to the Converging Zone. You know, not too many people get a chance to have a glimpse of heaven and then come back and talk about it. Our guest today, Dr. Mary Neal, has done just that. She's from Jackson Hole, Wyoming. She is a spinal surgeon. Welcome to the show today, Dr. Mary Neal. Mary.
Thank you. What a privilege.
It's great to have you here. It's great to hear your story. We've got the book, To Heaven and Back. Tell us about the story, the journey to where you went and what happened.
Well, my husband and I are avid kayakers. We've kayaked for years and years. And when my children were still young but were old enough for us to leave, we decided to go to Chile, to South America, and kayak with friends of ours who are professionals. They run raft and kayak trips all summer in Idaho, and then during the winter they run trips in Chile. So we went to Chile and had a wonderful time and loved the country and loved the people and kayaked all week. And what actually would have been our last day anyway, we had decided to kayak on a section of river that is well known for its waterfalls. And I don't mean crazy waterfalls. I mean drops of 10 to 15 feet, which may still sound crazy to a non-kayaker, but for a kayaker, that's something that is not unreasonable. Certainly challenging, but not unreasonable.
Is that considered level 5?
No, I've never been a class 5 boater.
Okay.
But definitely 4 plus.
Yeah.
And that morning, my husband actually didn't paddle with us. He woke up with terrible back pain, which he's never had before or after, but on that day he did. So he dropped us off at the put-in of the river, and then he drove off to find a nice place to read for the rest of the day, and he was planning on meeting us later at the takeout. So we put on the river, and at the time there were these friends of ours who are professionals and some other Americans, and I was with them, and we went over a couple of just introductory drops, and then as we approached the first big drop, we pulled off to the side of the river into an eddy and sort of discussed how we were going to run it, and we had decided to run the smaller chute. And a gal sort of bobbled past me, and she went into the chute, but she was sideways, and so the boat was sort of wedged between a couple of rocks, and she pulled her space skirt out and went downriver. I was already in the main current of the river, and when you're in the main current, it's not like you can turn around and paddle upstream. So I was committed, and I wasn't able to go down this smaller chute, so I had to veer off and go over the main drop. And as I went over the top of the waterfall, I could see the bottom, and there was tremendous flow, tremendous volume of water, tremendous force, and I could not see a clean exit or a clean outflow of water. And I knew I was going to have a little trouble. But I will say that my presumption was that I would hit the bottom, be flipped upside down, probably not be able to flip myself back up because of the turbulence, pull my spray skirt off, push myself out of the boat, be beaten up a little bit before I was spit out downstream. And that's an experience that is never enjoyable, but it certainly would not have been the first time I had been beaten up in a rapid. And I assumed that would happen. But when I hit the bottom of the drop, the front of the boat became pinned or stuck in the rocks and the underwater features. And I and my boat were immediately and completely submerged. And I'm a spine surgeon, as you said. I'm used to high stress situations. I'm a very calm person. And so I didn't panic. It wasn't the first time I'd been underwater in my boat. But I tried to rock the boat, and I tried to pull my spray skirt off. I tried to do anything I could think of that would either extricate the boat or extricate me. And it became clear very quickly that nothing I was doing was making a difference. And I'm a very pragmatic person. I knew nothing was working. I knew I was too far from shore for anyone to come and get me. And I have seen people drown in the river before. And so I knew that even if they could get to me, the likelihood of their actually being able to pull me out of the boat was pretty slim. And at that point, I made a very conscious choice after first being a little disappointed in myself for getting myself in this situation. But at that point, I asked that God's will be done. And it was certainly not the first time in my life that I have asked that. I think it's pretty common. I was raised in a church, and while I wouldn't have claimed to be overly religious, I would have claimed to be a Christian, and I've certainly said the Lord's Prayer plenty of times. But there was a qualitative difference. Oftentimes, I think most of us, certainly me, pray the Lord's Prayer and ask that God's will be done, but we don't really mean it. We want it to be done as long as it's in line with what we want to have happen. And I think that that was probably the first time when I asked that God's will be done, and I truly meant it, regardless of the outcome, and I gave up trying to control that outcome. And the moment I asked that, I was immediately and absolutely overcome with a very, very physical sensation of being held and comforted and reassured that everything was fine. My husband would be fine, my 4 young children would be fine, regardless of whether I lived or died. And
so you actually completely surrendered at that point. We talked about.
I did.
You surrendered.
It was a very active process. It wasn't a process of giving up. It was a very active choice of giving over control. And we went through a little bit of a life review, and it wasn't so much of a life review in terms of looking at an event and judging it. It was actually very profound because it was looking at events in my life, not in isolation, but looking at how they not only impacted the world and my environment and people 2 or 3 times removed, but really looking at how it had an impact 25, 30, 35 times removed, which was one of the profound aspects of this experience for me, because to realize that every event, every action, every decision, every human interaction has consequences. 25, 30, 35 times removed changes the way you view every moment of every day. And I was still aware of my circumstances.
So at this point, how many minutes in do you think consciously you can remember?
Oh boy.
It's hard to say.
I don't know. There was a very different sense of time.
Are you removed from time, you think, at that point of surrender? Or?
Well, certainly things change, and all sense of time and dimension change. Because at that time I was still aware of my circumstance. I could feel the water, I could feel the current, I could feel the current slowly pulling my body out of the boat. My little thought balloon off to the side, and again, I'm a very pragmatic, sort of cynical person, and I was looking at all this thinking, this is really strange. I knew that I had been underwater too long to be alive, but I felt more alive than I've ever felt.
Did you feel like you couldn't breathe, or what was the?
I never had a sense of air hunger or panic or fear, despite the fact that I grew up fearing a drowning death. And I don't know why. I'm a water person, I always have been. But when I grew up, I was always the person that said, well, I don't care how I die as long as I don't drown. I always thought it would be horrible. But the fact is that it was wonderful. I felt wonderful and alive, and I could feel my body being pulled over the front deck of the boat. And as it did that, of course, that's fine when it comes to your hips. When it comes to your knees, I could feel my knees bend back on themselves, and I could feel the bones breaking, ligaments tearing, and as an orthopedic surgeon, I thought, oh, that's probably my tibial plateau. And again, this little thought balloon off to the side kept thinking, well, I wonder if you're just not aware. I wonder if you're screaming and you have pain, but you just don't realize it. And so I would keep doing these little self-assessment exams, and no, I really didn't have pain, and I really didn't have fear. And as my body was coming out of the boat, I could feel my spirit peeling away from my body, sort of like peeling apart two pieces of tape. And then I finally felt my body break free from the boat, and when that happened, I could feel my spirit rise up and out of the river. And I was immediately greeted by a group of people, beings, spirits. I'm never really sure what to call them because those words mean different things to different people.
Kind of human form?
They did have a physical form, head, arms, legs. They were wearing these robes of sorts and were very brilliant so that the edges were not absolutely distinct. But they were absolutely overjoyed to greet me and welcome me and love me, and I them. And I knew, and when I use that word, no, it's a very different sense than the way we do.
Yeah.
I mean, I can say that I know this couch is leather, but that would be very different than being the person who actually raised the cow and slaughtered the cow and took the skin and did whatever you do to make leather and made a couch. I would know that that couch was made of leather and there'd be no room for discussion. And that's really the sense of knowing. I knew that these people or beings were there to greet me and guide me and protect me. I knew that they had been sent by God, were of God. And it was so joy-filled. I mean, now, of course, I wish I'd looked at them very carefully and said, gee, you know, who are you? Are you my grandfather?
Yeah.
And it's hard to describe, but at the time, there was a lot going on. And they were taking me down this exceptionally beautiful path toward this great dome structure of sorts that not only was exploding with beauty and color, but the absolute purity of God's love. And I could hardly wait to get there. I knew that that was essentially the entrance to heaven, to God's kingdom, whatever term you want to use. And I could hardly wait to get there. So when I looked at these people, it was almost as though, well, okay, there's plenty of time to chit-chat later. Let's get going.
Let's move it.
And there was this different sense, again, of time and space. And I was able to be with them and travel down this path and simultaneously look back at the scene on the riverbank. And by this point, my body had been sucked out of the boat and taken downstream. And I was able to watch as one of the guys, actually my body bumped into him, but he grabbed my wrist and I watched as he pulled my body over to the shore, and then they started CPR. And this guy was a young man at the time, he was only 18. And he's one of those guys that sort of, well, he's like a Labrador puppy. He's loving and innocent and vulnerable. And he kept calling to me to come back and please take a breath. And I would eventually be so overcome with compassion for him because he seemed so vulnerable that I would interrupt our progress and go back and take a breath and then leave because all he asked was for one breath. And then he would start calling, and the same thing would happen. And the cycle went on multiple times.
But there's nothing in you that wanted to go back
I
and
was
stay.
really surprised by a couple of things at that point because I did claim to be a Christian before this event, and I sort of hoped that there was life after death. I can't say I really spent much time thinking about it, and I didn't really have any preconceptions. And at that point, I was really surprised by two things. One is that as I look back at my body and look back at the guys doing CPR, I had no desire to return. I wasn't coming back. And don't get me wrong, I have a great life. I had a great life. I love my husband. I love my children more than I could ever imagine loving something on earth. But all of that paled in comparison to God's love.
Wow.
And I was absolutely overcome with the sense of being home, of being where I really belong, truly belong.
Peace for the others.
Well, I had been reassured
Yeah.
that they would be fine. And so,
Not a spoken voice, kind of a, how was God communicating to you?
well, I believe that when I was still on the boat that Christ was holding me. And that's something that I didn't talk about for a long time. And actually, when I first wrote the book, I didn't really identify him specifically because it seemed very presumptuous, out of context. I mean, who am I? And that actually was one of the first incredibly profound aspects of this for me, because what I realized was, yes, Christ was holding me, but the fact is Christ would be holding any one of us, if you ask. And that was profound. And the communication wasn't talking like we're talking. And I don't like the word telepathy because it sounds a little too woo-woo or something.
But there's a knowing.
But there's an absolute purity of communication. And it, as I look back on it, really allowed me to understand the whole idea of the Tower of Babel. God doesn't have to speak in English or any other language. It's this very pure sense of communication. And so we were making progress, but it was sort of the idea of 3 steps forward and 1 step back. And it was interesting to talk to this fella after the fact, because we were each both really irritated with the other for very different reasons. But eventually we did get down this path, and there was sort of this threshold, and I could see inside, and there were many other angels, spirits. Again, I'm not quite sure what to call them, but they were all very busy, and I knew they were all busy doing God's work. I don't know what it was, but they were all very busy, and I could hardly wait to cross that threshold. I wanted to just dive across.
What was this, when you talk about these people with you, now going back and thinking about it, do you think they were angels, or do you think they were part of the cloud of witnesses that were crossing dimensions?
I don't think they were angels. I think that they were, and again, I don't know whether to call them people or beings or spirits. I believe that they were spirits, as was I at that point.
Family, maybe?
I think that they were people. I knew that I had known them as long as I existed. And I knew that they had known me and loved me as long as I existed. I think had I taken the time to actually look at them, I probably would have identified them as particular people. Yeah. But I didn't take the time. And I do think that it's more along the lines of this cloud of witnesses. You know, it's like the cheering section, saying, all right.
And they're actually ushering you in.
Yes.
What a beautiful...
Well, and I absolutely believe that God sends his most gentle messengers to greet you and welcome you and guide you. And I did know that they were there to protect me. And I've been asked, from what? And I don't know that. I only know what I know. I don't pretend to know what I don't know. And so, yes, I think, as I look back on it, I think they were basically people, spirits.
Yeah.
And I think what I saw inside, I call them spirits. I don't know. I wouldn't say angels, but that's my own interpretation. I don't know. But that was another incredibly profound part of this experience for me, because as I was on the threshold, and I don't have the vocabulary to explain how it works. It's sort of like trying to describe a 3-dimensional world with 2-dimensional language. It's just not there. But it was profound, because it was at that point that it became very clear to me how it can be true that God actually knows each one of us, loves each one of us as though we're the only one, and has an incredible plan for our lives. And that to me was very profound, because it's something I had struggled with a little bit beforehand. How can God know each one of us? There are billions of us. And certainly, how can He love each one of us when we struggle to love the people in our neighborhood, the people that don't look like us, don't agree with us, don't share what we think is important? I think it's so difficult for people, including me, at the point to love. But it was incredible. And I can't tell you how it works, but I can reassure you that it really is true.
You experienced this.
I experienced
it. It's not
absolutely.
a theological concept.
No.
This is real.
It was real and absolute. And then a point came when there was this sense of disappointment that sort of descended on everyone, and I was told that it wasn't my time, that I had more work to do, and that I had to go back to my body.
And this was, again, the same type of communication, not verbal.
Right, it wasn't verbal.
Right.
It was this pure sense of communication or understanding. So I did what I thought was most reasonable at the time, which was say, no, I'm not going back. I'm here, you can't make me. But of course, they can make you. And so I was given some information at that time about some of the reasons, some of the work I still had to do. And then we went back down this same path, and this path was so beautiful, and it was as though I could not only see it and appreciate the beauty, but it was something I could taste and hear and experience. It's a very strange thing. It was as though it was all colors simultaneously, but their essence. Now, here on Earth, you mix all the colors and you get brown. But that was a different sort of thing. And so then we went back, and I laid down, and then I was reunited with my body. I won't say I was happy about it, but there I was.
What did you feel at that moment when you came back into your body? I mean, can you remember
Shock.
that part?
I couldn't believe that, as my kids would say, I was kicked out of heaven. I just couldn't believe it. And I was in that state for many months. I was, for the first 2 or 3 weeks, in a state really of feeling like I had one foot in this world and one foot in God's world. And for example, I had multiple broken bones, multiple orthopedic injuries, but I didn't have pain for almost 2 weeks. I had absolutely no pain.
Even when you went into your body at that moment, there was no pain.
I had no pain.
You still were. What do you think that was? Because you're a doctor.
I don't really know. All I can ever really come up with is the statement that where medicine and science ends, God begins. But I don't know. I really feel like I was truly still neither here nor there. And I really can't explain it. But I've gone back and looked at my medical records, because I just thought, this can't be true. And even when I was in the ICU, I had another out-of-body experience, and I had some other miracles occurred during that time. And I'm a cynic. I went back through my medical records because I really thought, no, I was being given some really great narcotics or some medication that would explain things away, but I really wasn't. Other than antibiotics, I didn't receive any.
What was the diagnosis of all the injuries? And I mean, it'd be nice to hear what those are. And then I'd like to hear about some of these episodes you had while you're still in this state, kind of here, there,
Sure.
in your mind and your spirit. It's interesting.
Well, it's funny because I had tibial plateau fractures. I had basically tore all the ligaments except the ACL. It's the only thing holding each knee together. So I had massive injuries all around my knees. And this is the part of the story that I'm never proud to talk about, and it's embarrassing to say the least because it doesn't make sense. But afterward, I decided I was going back to Wyoming for medical care. And I decided, because we already had our commercial flights lined up, that we were just going to fly home. We even have coverage for medical evacuation. I mean, none of that makes sense. There's no rational explanation except that there was no one in that environment who would tell us that we were crazy, because everyone we were with looked to us to make medical decisions. And my husband was in an absolute state of shock.
Yeah.
And so...
And your husband's a doctor too.
He is. He's an orthopedic surgeon.
Yeah.
And so he made splints for my legs, and we started flying home. And it's not something I would ever encourage or recommend to anyone else. And so by the time we did get back to Wyoming, I had a horrific case of ARDS, or this acute reaction in your lungs after any sort of shock. And at that point, the internist met us in the emergency room and basically told my husband at that time that I wasn't going to make it. And then I was in the ICU, and again, I was in a state of not caring, really. I
Peace.
Didn't want to be here anyway. So
how long were you actually under the water?
Well, if you talk to the people who resuscitated me, they would say it was about 30 minutes. I tend to focus on about 15 minutes because it was very confusing. With a waterfall, if you're down below, you can't see the boaters on top, and if you're above, you can't see below. And when people have a problem, you almost always see a boat or you see a kayaker in the water, but both aren't missing. Mm-hmm. And so when this happened to me, the boat and I were both missing. And so it took them a while to figure out that we were both missing, that we were neither up nor down. And once they realized that, then it took them a while to figure out where I might be, because I was about 6 or 8 feet under the water. And so they couldn't see the boat, they couldn't see me, they didn't really have any indication. Once they identified where they thought I was, then they started to watch, because as I said, they're used to water rescue. And on the watch was 15 minutes. So I tend to focus on 15 minutes because that's very concrete. They would readily say that no, actually it was more like 30. And the importance of that for me is that it takes off the table any of the rational explanations. When I came back, I spent many months trying to really think about these experiences that I had and come up with a reasonable explanation. I'm a scientist. I did believe in God, but at the same time, there must be a reason and a reasonable explanation. And so I, of course, thought about dreams and hallucinations, but those are two explanations that really have no bearing on this conversation, because the quality of the experience is totally different. The memory of the experience is totally different. Anyone who's had a near-death experience or an experience involving God would say the same thing, which is that I remember the details as accurately and precisely today as if it were happening real time. And that's true even if the event happened 50 years ago, 60 years ago.
It's an imprint, right, isn't it?
It's so different. I have many people in my office ask for a few more minutes to tell me their own story. And I practice in Wyoming. Some of these are, kind of old-time ranchers. They are not touchy-feely kind of people. And they'll go on to tell me their story, and it's always the same, which is that I remember this as though it's happening right now. And so dreams and hallucinations really weren't a reasonable explanation. So then I thought, well, okay, it's probably just the abnormal firing of the brain and basically the chemical death. after being without oxygen. And that's why the time is important, because the human brain hangs on to oxygen for about 6 minutes. And so if you sort of think about, okay, 6 minutes and then 2 or 3 minutes of dying and firing and chemical release, well, that brings us up maybe to 9 minutes. So, okay, give it a couple of more minutes. That still doesn't add up to the time I was without oxygen.
Yeah.
And so at some point, you have to say, well, no, those really don't explain it. And this is beyond what science can document.
It really was God.
It was.
Was Christ.
Absolutely. And the thing that's been interesting to me to think about over time, because this is now 12 years, 13 years, and I think the question really should be reversed. Because the question really shouldn't be, why believe my story, why believe someone else's story? It's really the opposite. Because there are hundreds of thousands of accounts of near-death experiences that share similarities. They occur over cultures and faiths and ages, and they're also similar. They all have similar components. Most of them talk about beauty, albeit differently. I like the mountains, maybe you like the desert. We see beauty differently, but we can still experience beauty. I personally have never met a single person who actually wanted to come back. I've met a couple of people who made a decision or made a choice, were given a choice, and they made a choice to come back for particular reasons, but even they didn't really want to.
Wow. Well, Mary, this is incredible. I'm thankful that we're actually going to be able to see you again on another episode. But how can people get in touch with you? I know that part of your purpose, and we'll talk about it in the next show, is to bring this to other people. How can they reach you and get your book and get a hold of you?
Well, the book is available everywhere books are sold. It's in bookstores and Amazon and all those places. And then I have a website, drmaryneal.com. And there's a way to contact me through that or Facebook.
Audience, Mary, thank you. Audience, heaven is real. Our Christ, our God is real. Mary, thank you so much. And
thank you. It's
come
my
back
privilege.
and see part 2 of our time with Mary. Thank you.
Thank you. It's my privilege.
God bless.